Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome back. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom's Torah study live and online. And I am joined this morning, as every morning, by my dear friends and teachers, Rabbi Sherry Hirsch of the American Jewish University and Rabbi Mark Gelman of the University of South Florida. And it's a delight to have both of you here. This week, we read in the Torah, Parsha Terumah. The Torah shifts, the story shifts, and now we are going to be reading of the beginning of the first institution, the Mishkan, the dwelling place of God in the world. And the most famous verse in this particular Torah portion is the 8th verse of the 25th chapter. God says to Moshe, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a mikdash, make for me a sanctuary, make for me a holy place, and I will dwell within the people. V'shachanti, not b'tocho, not in the sanctuary, but b'tocham, within the community of Israel, which only makes it even more ironic that this very week we're going to be having the holiday of Purim. The holiday of Purim is a goofy holiday. It is our version of Feast of Fools, which is to say that in many cultures, when winter begins to give way to springtime, with apologies to our family in Texas, when winter begins to thaw and we can come outside and begin to see the trees flowering and begin to see life return to the natural world, there is custom all over the world to celebrate. And to celebrate with a throwing off of restrictions and boundaries and bonds. So in New Orleans, they have Mardi Gras, or as a friend of mine from New Orleans likes to say, this year it's called Yardi Gras, because everyone's doing it at home. In Brazil, it's Carnival. It's this crazy festival of sensuality, drinking, dancing, eating, music. Across the world, this is the time of the Feast of Fools. And the Feast of Fools, the Carnival, the celebration of life's overcoming of death, is celebrated by throwing off the bonds that guide us and discipline us, that have held us fast through the course of the wintertime. And that's exactly what Purim is. In Purim, there's 4 principal mitzvot. We have a su'udah, we have a big feast. We give matanot le'evyonim, we share our bounty with the poor of the community. We send mishloach manot, care packages of sweets and goodies to our friends, and we read the Megillah. The Megillah is the great story of Esther and Mordechai, the great story of the events of salvation and rescue in the land of Persia some 2,800 years ago. And the custom is to upturn all of the customs of the synagogue. So other times in the synagogue, when we read a biblical book, we read it with some care and meticulous attention. Here we make grogger sounds. We make all kinds of noises as it's being read. And other times we come to synagogue to take our masks off and reveal who we really are. And on Purim, we put masks on and we masquerade and we pretend we're somebody else. And on other times we come to the synagogue to achieve a sober realism about who we are and what is our tasks in the world. And here on Purim, it is a custom to drink ad lo yada, until you can't tell the difference between good and evil, black and white, night and day. Please don't try this at home. When I was a young college student, I did, and it's not worth it, trust me. But that's the custom. These are the customs. It's part of the great celebration. And it's all gathered around this book. So today what I'd like to do is, with my dear colleagues and friends, to study that book. And I put together a little excerpt. It's a 10-chapter book, but I put a little excerpt. Now, what's odd about the book of Esther is it occurs at the end of the Hebrew Bible, in the 5 Megillot, the short books at the end of the Tanakh. And we're going to have to ask ourselves a couple of questions about it. Why, for example, the name of God is not found anywhere in this book? And how can you have a book of the Bible that doesn't include God, that doesn't include any of the salvation of God? And in what way did Esther respond to the other themes of the Tanakh, of the Bible? So I'm going to suggest that we just take a quick overview of the book, and we'll stop a few times and sort of cover where we are. Now, remember that the Tanakh, the Bible, begins, Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. And the first chapter of Genesis lays out God's creation of cosmos, a purposeful, orderly, law-driven, put together process of creation. And that's the world that we're presented in the beginning of the Tanakh. But here in the book of Esther, it's a different world, because while the Torah insists that the world is governed by a God of heaven and earth, it happened in the days of Achashverosh, that's the Persian king, that Achashverosh who ruled over 127 provinces. So whereas the world is governed by God, in this area of the world, from India to Nubia, is governed by Achashverosh. And he is a very different ruler than the Lord. Because in those days when Achashverosh occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administration of Persia and Media, all the nobles and governors. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom, the splendor of his glory. And in the end of it, he gave a banquet for 7 days for all the people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. Royal wine was served in abundance as befits a king, in golden beakers of design. And the rule was for drinking, no restrictions. So as the cosmos is governed by a God who respects the order of the world and imposes an order upon the events of the world and upon the phenomenon of the world, this book opens with a drunk king, a drunk, senseless, ignorant king, a fool. And he has no sense of how his decisions have consequences. And this book is going to ask us to consider that whereas Genesis thinks about the world as an orderly place, that's not our experience. The world is crazy because it's governed by crazy people. It's governed by this principle of craziness. And to give us a sense, the first sort of case study here, on the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered the 7 eunuchs in attendance to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal crown, to display her beauty to the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. But Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs, and he was greatly incensed. So here is the man who rules continents, who has conquered whole civilizations, but he can't get his favorite wife to come down because he intends to show her off to all of the men of his court as another one of his treasures, his playthings, his trophies. And she says, I'm not coming down. And of course, now we have a wonderful little scene because in Persian court dramas, you have to consult with all of the advisors to know what to do. So the king consults with all the advisors and he says, what should we do to Vashti? And now you know what you should do. And you'll see that in every one of the chapters of this book, there is a confrontation between life and death. Just as there is this time of year, winter is giving way to spring. Death is being pushed back in the way of life, in the presence of life. So Vashti should be put to death. That's what happens to a queen who refuses in public, in front of his whole court, to obey the rule of the king. But what happens is Memucan, who's one of the eunuchs, and ironically, it's the eunuchs who are the only real men in the whole story, declares in the presence of the king, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but against all the officials and all the men in the provinces. For the queen's behavior will make all women despise their husbands, uppity women. This will turn over all of civilization. And this is the great upheaval that he's going to have to prevent. How do you prevent an upheaval of women who suddenly think that they are allowed to make decisions about their own lives? So what should we do, says Memucan? Decree that she is banished. She doesn't have to sleep with Achashverosh ever again. And of course, Achashverosh's ego takes over at this point and says, that's the appropriate punishment. And she is exiled from the royal bedroom. And she is rescued by Memucan. The book is based on these moments of connection between life and death, between order and chaos, between what is concealed and what is revealed. Those are the themes of this book. And what's remarkable in this book is that the chapters of the book will alternate between chapters that are ribald comedy, strange, wild sex comedies, and serious genocidal plans. And what we're going to see is that the book of Esther, I think in the end, has buried a frightening political lesson in a ribald sex comedy. And that's what the book is about. So let's take a moment and stop before we introduce the next characters and ask Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Gelman to reflect, and particularly upon the fate of poor Vashti. Where does Vashti live today, Sherry?
Well, first I want to say, Eddie, there's nothing like listening to you tell a story. It's just riveting. You're the best storyteller I know. And I was just like, it's as if I never heard that Megillat Esther in my whole life, just listening to it now. But right as you were talking about Vashti, all that fire got in on me, because I kept thinking about how threatened they were by her, because clearly she had this power. Because when they say all the women will turn against their husbands, if she was a nobody, they would have been like, yeah, your wife refused her, put her to death, do something with her. But she had real influence. And Vashti's my favorite character in the story. So this idea that not only is she powerful, she exerts her power, but that she has influence. I mean, she would kill it on social media right now. You're on mute.
Mark, tell us about Vashti.
Well, look, the book is about female liberation. And I think that's the reason it's in the Tanakh. It's the only reason for the book, to balance the misogyny that we see occasionally throughout the other parts of the Torah. There's certain eruptions of egalitarianism in the Torah, like the daughters of Tzalachad, who come to Moses because they want to inherit. They think it's just because their father didn't have sons, and Moses says no, and God says yes. And so there are occasions where the rights of women are lifted up, but this book is really about women and about their power. And the interesting thing is that the woman who exerts the most moral influence in the book is not Esther, it's Vashti. She's the one who takes the courageous move. Esther's defending her people and all of that. And Esther goes along with this, let me be the trophy wife of the new king. She doesn't take one step to defend Vashti, not 1 inch, not 1 word, not nothing. So if you want to defend Esther, go ahead. I'm not with you.
But Eddie, don't you think what's interesting, and I'm going to interrupt you, Mark, I think I couldn't agree more, is they could have skipped the whole part of Vashti and left it out of the story.
Right.
And yet it's included, which double downs on Esther's sort of passivity. So I think that's also an interesting.
Well, they had to include her because she was the queen. And if they didn't include her, then why is he looking for Esther?
They could have said the queen had a bad day. She didn't show up. He's looking for a hot new girlfriend.
Because you have light and shadow in this story. You're going to have, in just a moment, I'll introduce you to the hero and the villain, Mordecai and Haman, light and shadow. And here you have Vashti and Esther, light and shadow. And the question is, can you find some light in the shadow? That's what we're going to find in a moment. So let's move on with the story. You ready?
So beautiful.
Now, there is a kind of comedy. When I was a little kid, I loved Laurel and Hardy movies. And the comedy structure of Laurel and Hardy is that whatever solution you arrive at a problem creates a much bigger problem because you can't foresee what's going to happen next. And having banished his wife sometime after, when the anger of Achashverosh subsided, he thought of Vashti. So here's poor King Achashverosh in his big king-size bed, all alone. And what she had done and what he decreed, and he's all by himself, and he misses her because she was the favored wife. And the king's servants who attended said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province, and we'll gather all. So they gather all of the marriageable young women of the entire kingdom, and they gather them together, which, I mean, you've got to imagine that presents certain problems also. And they're brought into the harem. And they're all prepared. And what's going to happen isn't a beauty contest. That's what we learned in Hebrew school. It's a whole lot more pernicious than that. It's a sex contest, basically. Each girl gets one night with the king. And then he chooses the one he wants, and the ones he doesn't want get banished to the harem, and they'll never be heard from again. And that's what happens, right? This is the life of you talk about misogyny. Whew. So now we get the new characters. Here's the second and third characters. In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew, Ish Yehudi, by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite who'd been exiled with King Yehoiakim by King Nebuchadnezzar. And he was the foster father to Hadassah, whose name is also Esther. His uncle's daughter, she is an orphan. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and it tells us a second time that she was an orphan, and that's why Mordechai adopted her. The king's edict was proclaimed, all the girls go in, and Esther was taken too. And the king, and she pleased everybody. Everybody she saw, she's much like Joseph. Everyone she touches falls in love with her. But she did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. So as opposed to Vashti, who is so outspoken, Esther keeps quiet. And the contrast between the two descriptions. So first of all, we have these two names, Mordecai and Esther, which are now very popular Jewish names, but they're not Hebrew. No. Mordecai is derived from Marduk, who was the patron god of the Babylonians, who the text tells you were the people who destroyed Jerusalem and exiled his family. And Esther is Astarte, who is the patron goddess. She's the consort of the god. Now, how long do you have to live in diaspora before you start naming your kids for the gods of the people who exiled you? How long before Jewish kids have those names? And that's exactly what happens. These are highly assimilated, highly acculturated, comfortable diaspora Jews.
Is this like naming your child Kristen or Christy?
Or Adolf, I mean, something even worse, right?
Right, I think that's the parallel.
Exactly.
Well, or Zeta Ian and Bubba Jennifer.
Right.
At some point, these aren't going to be Zeta and Bubba names, but that's who they are. And
Mackenzie, right.
And I used to joke about, the future, what happens with Zeta, Ian, and Bubba Jennifer. Do they know how to make a Jewish dish of any kind? Do they? What do they know? What can they preserve?
But what's left, of course, is even though we wonder how much Jewishness is left in these people, which is exactly the right question to ask. How has Jewish life fared in diaspora? The whole Bible is about coming home to Eretz Yisrael, coming home to God's dwelling in Jerusalem. But here's a book of people who have no intention of coming home. They could have come home. By now, Jerusalem is rebuilt, but they didn't come home. They're living comfortably in Persia. Thank you very much. And they're very assimilated. And yet, when it comes to Esther entering the harem, he tells her, shush still, don't tell him you're Jewish. So deep inside of a fifth generation diaspora Jew lurks the fear that if I'm found out, something really bad could happen to me. That's what's left.
Eddie, and she listens to him, unlike Vashti. Right? Not only are they totally assimilated, not only does he have this deep, dark secret that he tells her to be private, but she doesn't even say back to him, seriously? Are you kidding me? She just passively listens to him, which is the total foil to Vashti.
Now, the story goes on, and there's some beautiful detail, which we're not going to have a chance to take a look at. She ends up going to the king. The king loved her more than anyone, and she displaces Vashti. She becomes the new queen. Now, years pass, and here's the drama that enters the story. So at this point, we could have ended the story. It's a very nice story. Jewish girl does good. But what happens next? Achar hadvarim ha'ele, says the Torah, says the book. After these things, right? Sometime afterwards, King Achashverosh promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, son of the Agagite, and he advanced him and seated him higher than all the fellow officials. All the king's horses and all the king's men knelt and bowed low to Haman, for that was the king's order. He's the king's minister. You bow to him as if you'd bow to the king, but Mordechai wouldn't bow. And the question is, why wouldn't Mordechai bow? What's his motivation? And we don't know. because the next line is very obscure. They ask him, why do you disobey? And he didn't tell them. He wouldn't listen to them when they asked him, and they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail. And then it throws in, and he explained to them that he was a Jew. So does his not bowing have anything to do with the fact that he's Jewish? Does his not bowing mean that he doesn't like Haman? Does his not bowing mean that he and Haman have a previous history? Right? One of these days, by the way, I'm going to write the wicked version of the Megillah and have Mordecai be the bad guy and Haman be the good guy, because they have a backstory. Don't you see? They were classmates, and somehow this guy gets promoted and Mordecai doesn't. The Talmud says that the problem is that Haman carried an idol of a god that he worshipped around his neck, and Mordecai was afraid to bow because he didn't want to be seen bowing to the idol. But that's only trying to figure out, why won't he bow? But the important part isn't why won't he bow. The important part is what happens next. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow low to him, he was filled with rage. Everyone else bows, but he won't. It's the theory of the missing tile. You have a ceiling full of tiles, but if one is missing, that's what your eye catches. If you ever had a white sweater and got one tiny spot on it, that's all you see. He is the kind of character, he is in a sense a totalitarian. He wants everyone to bow to him. He wants uniformity in the kingdom. He wants obedience in the kingdom. And the fact that Mordecai won't bow obliterates for him, blinds him from the fact that everybody else bows. The whole kingdom bows to him. But the fact that one Jew won't bow to him, that becomes a problem. And so he decides to do away with all the Jews. First of all, because he'll show Mordecai who's really boss, right? He'll wipe out the whole people. But more than that, because we have always been the exception to somebody's desire for uniformity. We are always the exceptional one. We are always the rule breaker, right? When I was a kid in school, it was me and Laura, who were the only two kids in the class who wouldn't sing the Christmas songs in the class Christmas program. I was the only idiot who brought matzah sandwiches on Pesach. We have always been the other one, the exception, the one that is different. And that bothers Haman. That bothers Haman to no end. So what does he do? He consults with his court astrologers, casts the dice called Purim, because that's how things work in this world. It's all a throw of the dice. And he decides the day he's going to destroy the Jews. And he goes to the king and he makes this speech, which is the first articulation of classic anti-Semitism. There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It's not in your interest to tolerate them. Let an edict be drawn for their destruction. They're different. They're strange. They're uncanny. They're an exception. And we don't need to have that in the kingdom. That is the totalitarian impulse that lives in the heart of Haman. It's the need to control everyone. And if there's a people and a person who resists that control, it drives him nuts. Tell me about Haman.
Well, look, the thesis is beautiful. It has a little problem with the facts. And the facts are that anti-Semitism in its worst incantation, in its worst iteration in history, happened in a culture in which the Jews were not different, in Weimar Germany, in which Jews were completely assimilated. It also happened in Muslim Spain when the Almohades purged the whole area, and it happened with Ferdinand and Isabella, and it's why Maimonides had to go back to Egypt. He had to leave. And so very advanced cultures with very assimilated Jewish communities have been, over time, Spain and Germany are the examples, and here Persia, have been the locus of the worst anti-Semitism. So if you want a lesson from that, the lesson is not that they hate us because we're different. The answer is they hate us because we aren't different. And we are a people who want to be assimilated. And the source of the anti-Semitism in both Spain and Germany and Persia was not hatred of the Jews. It was a bank job, Eddie. It was a bank job. They wanted the wealth of the Jewish community. And the only way to get that wealth was to exterminate the Jews. Pope Innocent III issued in 1302 a papal bull which canceled all the debts of the church to the Jews. And the reason was, well, Jews didn't accept Jews. Well, that wasn't the reason. The reason was that 80% of church lands were mortgaged to Jews. So, and the way that Hitler armed the Reich, not to say Hitler didn't hate Jews, of course he did, but the reason for the initial drive of the Third Reich against Jews was to expropriate the money of the Jewish community, billions of marks that were used by Hitler to arm the Reich for the Anschluss, for the invasion of Austria. And so the economic motivation, and not some ideological motivation or some kind of reverse take on our pride at being different. That's my take on anti-Semitism. It's a bank job.
Sure.
I would not say it's all or nothing, Mark. And I think Eddie makes a significant point. The Megillah goes out of its way to tell us that Mordechai did not bow and that it ticked off Haman. And that detail is not an economic argument. That's a detail of ego. And I think there's many things that are the source of anti-Semitism. I am not an expert. Michael Berenbaum is. There's many people that are. And I would never even presume to talk about what the source of that kind of evil is or hatred. But what I would say in this particular story, this is a lot about ego. Haman's ego, Ahasuerus's ego, Vashti's ego. This is a lot about individuals and how they behave, driven by their Yetzer Hara, driven by those things that get under their skin. And I think one of the messages of the Megillah that I'm sure Eddie will talk about is, what does it say about how we should behave? And who are we in each of these characters? What's part of us is Haman, and what part of us is Mordecai? What part of us is Esther? What part of us is Ahasuerus? Because we're not just one character, but many, just like in the four sons in the Haggadah. And I think there's parallels too.
I would only argue with
something is mentioned as a reason doesn't mean it's the reason.
Doesn't mean it's not the reason either.
No, but the fact is that if you look at the motivation for an attack on a people, you can personalize it with individual examples of ego. That's an interesting move. But you have to look at the historical confluences that cause something to happen. And if it's the case that the attack on the Jewish community was an attempt to expropriate their wealth versus the ego of some...
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just not saying it's the only reason.
Well,
and I'm also saying that there are many examples where it gets down to ego as being a very pivotal factor in the dynamic.
Right.
It's not all or nothing.
I wouldn't say it's
the
ego.
Holocaust didn't happen because of Hitler's ego.
No, but it didn't happen because of economics either.
Correct. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not all or nothing.
Nor did the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Yes, that was a collateral advantage, a benefit to the regimes that expelled or destroyed their Jews. But Lucy Davidovich and her history of the Holocaust demonstrates very clearly that long after it was clear that the war was lost, they kept going to kill Jews. Eichmann killed 500,000 Hungarian Jews long after it was clear that the war was going to end badly for them, because it was a war against the Jews. It was something much deeper. It's true that they got a collateral benefit of billions of marks from that. And it's true also that the crown of Ferdinand and Isabel got whatever pesetas or whatever it was from expelling the Jews, but there was something much deeper. It had to do with a culture and an identification of who the other is, and a holding on to an affirmation of self by rejecting the other. And there, I think it may not be called ego, but I think it's deeply psychological and deeply cultural in this.
Yeah,
So
the problem I have with the whole thing is this. First of all, about the Hungarian Jews, Hitler, with all of his insane anger and anti-Semitism, offered to sell the Hungarian Jews for their liberation to Rudolf Kastner, and there was a whole fight with Ben Gurion and the Kastner affair. So that's a complicated case. The point of it is that if it's the case that people hate Jews because we're different, then the conclusion you must draw is a conclusion I will not draw. And that is, people will always hate us. And
well,
I'm not
wait till we get to the end of the book, because I think that's the question at the end of the book. So let's hold on to that, Mark. It's a very good point. So just hold on. Let's get a little bit farther into the drama of the book. So I want to suggest that here's where we are. We have a picture of power in the person of Ahasuerus. And what the book is telling us is that power is drunk and foolish and has no particular way to go. And then we have a picture of evil. And evil has nasty designs, but evil can't do anything until it finds its way to power. And that's what's just happened. Evil has connected with power. And that's the locus of danger in this circumstance, in this world that we live in. So now the question is, how do you separate evil from power? How do you keep evil from power? And here I think we're getting to the crux of the book, the most interesting part of the book. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went through the city crying loudly and bitterly until he came in front of the palace gate. What is he doing in sackcloth and ashes, and what is he crying loudly and bitterly about? Because the biblical theology is that when you perform mitzvot, God blesses you. But when you sin, God curses you. Bad things happen, you get punished. So if a community is in trouble, it means that they have sinned and they have to do tshuva. And what he's doing is collective tshuva. The whole community is praying. The whole community is doing tshuva. He is asking God for forgiveness so that God will release the people from this terrible curse of potential destruction. Except for one thing, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And that's one of the interesting lessons of the book. The traditional stance of the Jew, either in terms of the Bible's idea, which is when you're in trouble, pray and God will save you, repent and God will save you, or the strategy of good diaspora Jews like Mordecai, who pay their taxes, obey the law, do the right thing, and the non-Jewish government will notice you and will be good to you. Neither one of those strategies work. In fact, it's even more than that. I want to go one more step, because if you tell any kid, name a story that takes place in the Middle East and has these four characters, it has a foolish king, his evil advisor, a beautiful princess, and a brave hero from outside the palace, any 10-year-old will tell you that's Aladdin. That's Aladdin, because Aladdin and Esther come from the same literary source, from Persian court dramas. And those are the classic themes of Persian court dramas, except that there's one more character in Aladdin, and that's the character of the genie. And we're missing a genie here. Now, we need a genie. Who should we cast as a genie? And it's really clear who we should cast as a genie now that Robin Williams isn't around. Who should we cast as the genie? God. God should be the genie. You should be able to rub a lamp, and God should show up and say, what are your 3 wishes? And you say, I want to be released from the curse. And God says, done, and it's finished. And that's exactly what the book of Esther is trying to say. God is not your genie. God is not your genie. And this is where the book becomes very radical. Because neither your traditional strategies of prayer and repentance, nor good civic behavior, nor God coming down from heaven and saving you the way God does in the book of Exodus. This isn't Pesach. This is Purim. They don't work anymore. So now you're going to need a radical new approach to this. And how do you do it? You need somebody on the inside It turns out we have somebody on the inside. So Mordechai goes and he leaves a message for Esther and says, you've got to come. And she doesn't know that this is the decree. She lives in the palace, and the palace is hermetically sealed off. They don't no CNN, they get no MSNBC, they get no Fox, they get no newspapers, they get no magazines. She just spends all day long cosmetics and fashion. She doesn't know that this is happening, and Mordechai sends word to her that this is what's happening. You have to go to the king, he says, and you have to appeal to him to overturn, plead with him for her people, overturn this decree. And when he says this to her, this is her response. All the king's courtiers and the people in the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there's one law, that he's put to death. Only if the king extends the golden scepter may he live. I have not been summoned for 30 days. So he says to her, listen to the dissymmetry in this. He says to her, we have been condemned to die. And she repeats to him, palace protocol gobbledygook. Don't you understand that there's a rule? And the rule is that you have to be invited, and I haven't been invited, and it's been 30 days. And if I show up and I'm not invited, and you can see the dissymmetry, because what she's really saying to him is, I don't want to go. I like being the queen. I have found my place here. It's the ultimate assimilation. I mean, these were already assimilated Jews, assimilated into Persian life, Jews who had Persian or Babylonian names. And now she's in the palace and she's oblivious to what's going on outside, and she likes it that way. And she says, I'm not going. And he has to find a way to change her and change her mind. Sherry.
And this is the first time that she speaks up. Right? It's the opposite. Before, he tells her what to do and she's passive, and we think she's going to be passive, but suddenly she's now in a position or a place of power, and she finds her voice, which I think is ironic, because even though it's not the voice we want her to find, it's still the distortion of power in what your role as a leader is.
And she was told to be quiet, and now he's telling her to speak up. And if you've practiced being quiet for long enough, it's hard to start speaking up. And she has all that accumulated fear, because this has been her MO. This is the way she lives her life, not letting anyone know who she is. She's hiding. The word Esther is a Babylonian Egyptian name, a Babylonian Mesopotamian name from the word Ishtar. But in Hebrew, lahastir means to hide. She's the hidden one. She's the one who hides her neshama, her soul, her identity, her being in the world. There's a whole Talmudic discussion of how she avoided sleeping with him by hiding in the palace. She made him play hide and go seek every time he wanted to sleep with her. She's the hidden one. And all of a sudden, what has Mordechai said to her? I need you to come out and be visible. Come out wherever you are. Ali oxen free. And she said, I'm terrified, because to be made visible is to be made vulnerable. It's to imitate the position of the Jews outside the palace walls, to be made vulnerable.
But what if you see that as a step towards her courage that we're going to see later? That in the beginning, when Mordechai speaks to her, she says nothing. Now she speaks against him, but this is the beginning of her finding her voice, which will lead to the courage that she needs to make the really hard decisions.
She's finding her voice. She's finding her strength. Right? Mark, you got something?
No.
Okay. So now, how do you wake her up? How do you get her out of this trance? How do you get her out of this palace life, this palace culture, to see the real margins of existence? Mordechai makes 3 claims on her. And it's really interesting to ask which of the ones is the one that does it. Claim number 1. Do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. So number 1, honey, you're not going to pass forever. Eventually, someone will find out who you are. Someone will talk. And when they talk, your fate will be our fate. Your destiny is the same as ours. You can't hide forever. That's the first claim. Here's the second claim. It's a little more complicated. On the contrary, he says, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish.
There it is. That's the reference to God you were looking for, Eddie.
That could be. We'll figure out something else. Now, You and your father's house, but she's an orphan. She has no father's house. So he's referring to something much bigger. He says, if you stand by and watch this happen to us and do nothing, something will die. Your connection with who you are, your connection with your past, your real identity. Remember, she has two names. She has an inside name and an outside name. Her inside name is Hadassah. Her outside name is Esther. She's been living the Esther life. And what he says to her is, the Hadassah in you will die. The Hadassah, Joseph had two names also, remember? That's why he wanted to reconnect with his brothers, because he wanted someone who knew his name. He says to her, something in you will die, and you will never again be connected with your people. And then the last thing he says to her is, and who knows, mi odea, perhaps you haven't attained to royal position for just such a crisis. There is a larger narrative into which your life fits. And now you can see it. You were born for this moment. All of these strange events, you're taken into the Vashti's abdication, you're taken into the palace, you're chosen to be queen, you're sleeping with the king, you're right there with the king. There's got to be some bigger reason for this. And here's the moment of truth that you discover your bigger reason. So the question is, which one did it? Claim number one, you can't pass forever. Claim number two, this is the moment you have to say who you really are, that you belong to somebody. Or claim number three, that your life has a narrative. Your life has a purpose. Your life has a meaning. And this is the moment that that meaning calls upon you. Which one changes Esther?
Mark, I'm letting you go first.
Well, to me, it's clear, and that's the second, which is the idea that you can't escape the fate of your people. We all know the stories of German Jews who wore their World War I medals into the gas chamber. And they were patriotic Germans, and they couldn't believe that their homeland would do this. And they thought their fate would be different, and they could escape this fate because they were German patriots, and they were killed along with all the other Jews. So that argument that you cannot escape the fate of your people is, to me, the great argument. It's Herzl's argument. It's the fundamental argument of Zionism and its response to anti-Semitism, which to me is the strongest of all the Zionist claims. That this is our homeland, and this, which of course it is, but it's that this is the only solution to catastrophes aimed at the Jews, which is to have our own land, where they can't keep us out like the ship to St. Louis, where they can't send us like a driven leaf blowing around the world to try and find a safe haven, and hoping that the dictator Batista would open up Cuba for us, which he did. No, you share the fate of your people unless you re-enter the world of history and power, and you gain enough power, world power, military power, to protect your people from all possible assaults.
That was beautiful, Mark. I don't know which of those was the convincing phrase for Esther, but I do know that the last one to me is one of the most powerful statements in the entire Megillah. And I think one of the reasons the Megillah is in there. It is the Torah directly saying to us, you have no idea why you were put here, but you have a task and you have a tafkid and you were here for a reason. And your job is to figure that out and execute on it. And I think that messaging is one of the critical, central, most important messages of Megillat Esther. And one of the reasons I think it's included in the canon and also read on Purim, which is one of the most silly days of the year, the day that you think like, what are we doing here? Why is this all meaningless? Da, 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 da. At the heart of the story is you have purpose to be here, and your job is to figure that out. So which one she listened to, I don't know, but I hope that we all hear that third one very loudly and clearly.
It's wonderful. And it's wonderful that it's spoken to a female character, a very feminine female character. All of you have purpose. It's not just that the men are the actors in history, but you too have a role, in a starring role in this history. Well, let's wrap this up. What's going to happen, of course, is she's going to go to the king. The king is not going to kill her. The king is going to welcome her. She's going to invite Haman and the king to a banquet. And then at that banquet, she invites them to another banquet. And after a couple of days of heavy drinking at this banquet, the denouement arrives. And what's wonderful, again, is Esther. It's all hidden. 3 characters show up, and each has a very different idea of what's going on. The king shows up because he loves parties. He lives for parties. And the queen his favorite queen has invited him to a party where they can eat and drink. What could be better? Haman shows up, and it's the epitome of his ego. He is the only one, the only non-royal invited to the party. He, the king and the queen. What could be a more exalted position than to sit and drink with the king and the queen? And Esther shows up, ready to snap the trap. And here it comes. So when they're gathered and they're drinking well, on the second day, the king again asked Esther at the wine feast, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request?" And you have to read this with a sort of sense of suspense. It's got to come slowly, and the music has to rise, right? Bum, bum, bump, right? "Even half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Queen Esther replies, "If your majesty will do me the favor, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted me as my wish and my people as my request, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Suddenly, Achashverosh is sober again. He snaps out of his drunk and he says, "Who did this? Who would take my queen away?" He remembers the loneliness, the cold bed he suffered when Vashti was taken away. Who would take away and threaten the life of his most beloved queen? And the Hebrew is just great. It's mi hu ze ve'eze hu. Who is it and where is he who dared do this? And she replies, "The adversary and enemy is the evil," 1, 2, 3, Haman. And now, just as it does over and again, the genocidal evil of the story, the genocidal terror of the story is submerged under ridiculousness. The king gets so angry that his trusted advisor would try to take away his queen, that he needs to get a breath of fresh air, and he goes outside. He goes into the palace garden. And while he's outside, Haman realizes his goose is cooked. All he can do is beg for his life. So he begins blubbering and begging Queen Esther, and she's lying on a divan, on a couch. We have to think about this in 1950s Middle East movies like Sinbad, right? In bad Technicolor. She's lying on this in a chiffon gown, having a slave put grapes in her mouth, and he is begging her. And as he's begging her, he's going up the divan, the couch, until he's looking right in her face. But that means he's laying right on top of her. Now, there are many places you're allowed to lay in Shushan, but not on top of the queen. That's not proper. And when the king returns from the palace, Haman was lying on the couch, which Esther reclined. Does he mean to ravish the queen in my own palace? No sooner did these words leave his lips, Haman's face was covered with terror. Harbona, one of the eunuchs, shows up and says, "Yeah, but there's a stake in front of his house that he put up for Mordecai, who had previously saved the king." And the king says, "Impale him on it." And so everything that Haman planned to do was done to him. And the wheel of fortune turns, and Mordecai becomes the favorite of the king. He gets the ring and the power to rule the kingdom. Esther is returned to her royal station. And after a terrible war, when 75,000 people get killed, everyone lives happily ever after. Thank you very much. And what's the meaning of the story? So I think Mark has a good hold on this. It seems to me that this is a ribald, funny, goofy, crazy carnival story. It's a sex comedy. It's a drinking game comedy, right? Except what happens is that is used as a front, a beard, a ruse, in order to submerge a very difficult lesson. And the difficult lesson is you don't live in the world of Pesach anymore. In the world of Pesach, there's a God who will free the slaves and cast Pharaoh into the Nile. That's not the world you live in anymore. In the world we live in, the world is ruled by blind, dumb, foolish power. And in that world, the only way to keep evil from gaining power and destroying you is to get closer to power than evil is. You have to sleep with power. You have to get right into the bedroom of power. That's the image. And now the paradox is that the closer you get to power, the farther into the palace you go, the more likely it is you're going to forget why we sent you, why you're there. You're going to forget yourself and your mission being there and your purpose. You're going to forget yourself. You're going to become a palace person. And then the question is then, how do we wake you up? How do we remain vigilant and understand that this is the purposes for which we've been put into that position? And I think that what we have here is a brutally realistic political drama submerged into the funniest ribald sex comedy in the Bible. That's how I understand the story. And that's why the holiday, yeah, go ahead.
That's beautiful and on the mark, and the fact that it's my thesis is just beside the point. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at a contrast, very interesting contrast, between the Jews in America and in the world in the Holocaust, and if you look at the fact that and if you look at Weimar Germany at the beginning, the Jews of Weimar Germany, the Germany before the war, had forgotten who they were. Franz Rosenzweig, except for a Rosh Hashanah theophany, was an inch away from converting to Christianity. Karl Marx's father converted so that he could be a lawyer and have a job. And the complete ignorance of the Weimar Jews to the possibility of radical evil and what the danger was precisely the result of their assimilation, directly and clearly. Whereas the American Jews, who were far more assimilated than Weimar Jews on superficial levels, there weren't a lot of cheeseburgers eaten in Weimar Germany, but they are in America, so I hear. And the fact is that in America, it's a very different situation, because here you have a radically assimilated Jewish community, large swaths of profound ignorance about Jewish life and lore and theology, but you have something the Weimar Jews did not have, and that is Israel. Israel is the conscience of the diaspora. Israel is the voice that says to diaspora Jews, remember who you are, and remember why you were put here, why there's now, I don't even know what the new number of Jews in the Senate and the Congress are. I mean, Biden's administration has a million in it, I know that. But it's Israel that is the conscience of the American Jewish community, reminding us, hopefully reminding us that we must be on guard, and we must use our power to protect our people, to protect Israel. And it's that idea. It's that we now have a genie, and that genie is Israel. And that's what changes everything. That is why the creation of Israel ushers in a new commonwealth. It's as significant as the destruction of the temple, the first and the second. It totally upends all the other scenarios of how we chose to live in the diaspora, which was primarily a single belief that if we were powerless, no one would kill us, because there's no advantage in killing powerless people, because you can't conquer their land. They don't have a land. After Israel, we understand that power must be seized, democratically, of course, and used democratically to protect the interests of the Jewish people. And that's why, if you ask diaspora Jews, what are the foundations of your Jewish identity? Everyone, even those who have never been to Israel, will include Israel, and some include the Holocaust. But those pillars, but particularly Israel, are the foundation that gives us a new way to live in the diaspora.
Good gesagt, good sermon. We're going to finish today with an ancient Jewish tradition.
Oh my God.
A joke. Jews have been telling jokes since Abraham.
Yeah.
Abraham told jokes. So, Mark, do you have a Jewish joke for us?
I got the greatest Jewish joke you've ever heard.
Sherry, have you got a joke for us?
Oh, I don't tell jokes. Like, there are people that tell jokes and there are people that don't tell jokes.
All right,
I'm funny, but I don't tell jokes.
You are wonderfully funny. So, all right, we're going to give you a bye, but we're going to see if Gelman has the Jewish joke.
First of all,
go ahead. Come on.
Tell a joke. Groucho understood this totally.
Okay.
You need a cigar.
Tell the joke. Tell the joke.
So every year I give an award for the greatest Jewish joke of the year. And then this joke came along, and I no longer give the award because it's impossible to surpass this joke. And it's a joke with deep meaning as well. And it's a clean joke.
So only a rabbi would give you a sermon before he gives
I
the
was
joke.
going to say, tell the joke. Tell the joke,
damn
Mark.
joke. Come on.
Hang on. I got to get my cigar.
You're getting
Okay, well, tell the joke.
Okay. So the Harvard crew team beat the Yeshiva University crew team every year. That's actually the joke. But every year, Yeshiva University's crew team lost to Harvard in a 3-mile race. They lost by 2 miles and 7/8 every year. So the president of Yeshiva calls in the coach of the Yeshiva University crew team, whose name was Shapiro. His first name was Biff, because he was the crew chief. So he calls in Biff, and he says, listen, Biff, I don't ever expect to beat Harvard. That's too much to expect. But we just can't lose this badly. And if you continue to lose to Harvard, I'm going to have to fire you. So Biff Shapiro runs out, desperately afraid, comes back about a week later into the president's office, screaming and yelling, I got it. I figured it out. I understand their secret. I understand why they beat us every year. President asked him, all right, so what's their secret? He said, they got 1 guy shouting and 6 guys rowing.
Very funny. Very funny. Very cute.
Now, why is this funny? This is funny for... I got you, Eddie.
This
What
is funny
happened there?
because, Mark,
Eddie disappeared from my universe, which is frightening to me.
okay, but we're going to wrap up for him. So
Okay,
this is
so-
funny because,
It's funny because of 2 reasons. One, you have to understand it's about Jews are argumentative. So the yeshiva team had more than 1 guy shouting, and that's fun. The second thing is that it's a truth of life. And the truth of life is that if you run an institution, and Sherry, you're the most gifted administrator I've ever run across in my life. You are gifted beyond to run institutions. if you are as
I don't know
good
if that's a compliment, Eddie. Is that part of the joke?
I'm just saying. But if you run an institution, the first thing you have to figure out is, what is the ratio of shouters to rowers? And unless the ratio is 6 rowers to every 1 shouter, your institution is sick and you need to change.
Ay, ay, ay. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Sherry. It's been wonderful learning together. I wish you a happy Freilach Purim. Take good care. Stay well.
Eddie,
Guy's rowing
I just
and
want to
only
say
one
one
guy
thing.
shouting.
Enjoy the home and talk.